was born typically after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what happens is that when you have alliances, counter-alliances, those individuals who don't want to participate in this kind of game are kind of forced to take a side. They're forced to choose, right? Because if they don't, then they become kind of like stuck out there on their own, and they're essentially, in a way, very vulnerable. Now, there are some countries that have been able to kind of stay neutral, like Switzerland, for example. But then again, who's been in Switzerland? I mean, that's a very difficult place to go to, isn't it? I mean, all those mountainous regions, from a geographical point of view, they have the luxury of what? Of not having to choose, because it's very hard to invade. Or over the years, it's been very hard to actually do something in Switzerland. Same thing with the United States, right? The United States pretty much was living on its own. Now it was brought in, it kind of got pushed into the war, okay? But the point is the United States was able to be isolationist for a very long period of time. Why? Because as a country, at least in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, it was relatively self-sufficient. Now, those concepts have changed today because of globalization. We rely on each other a lot more today than we ever did before, because all these markets now are very interconnected. If something happens in the United States, China will feel the pain. Europe will feel the pain. If something happens in this part of the world, everyone is going to feel the pain. Okay? When I say pain, I mean economically. Now, so we have realists who are arguing. So, okay, counter-alliances, people are forced to take sides. The other thing about alliances, and this, when you think about it, it's very logical, and that is realists pretty much advocate this concept of the country will always do something in its own self-interest. And that assumption has always been very ironclad, meaning it doesn't really leave a lot of room for what?
Change.
Well, not change, but if you assume countries will always act in their own self-interest, what you're basically saying is I will always do what's in my interest regardless of what you do. But when you enter into an alliance, what does that suggest?
That someone else.
You gotta kind of monitor each other, right? You gotta control each other's behavior, and that was the whole point about the realist criticism of intergovernmental organizations, and that is whenever you form an entity that is higher than the nation state, right? That basically means what? Each nation state has to give up some of its sovereignty. And that is illogical from a realist point of view, because the argument is, this is whatever is in the interest of the nation state is first and foremost, right? So the point here is that you have this kind of control issue on the part of countries entering into alliances. How do you make sure every country who enters into the alliance is doing what they said they're going to do? Okay, and of course, from a realist point of view, today's friend is most likely could be, or most likely will be tomorrow's enemy. Meaning, you have these relationships are very fleeting. These aren't very. It's impossible to have these strong ties amongst countries because of the self-interest argument. Another thing that the realists argue is this whole issue of adaptability, your flexibility, your ability to respond to a situation. The more members you have in the alliance, the more agreements you need to get before you act on something. Think about the criticisms of NATO as it related to the most recent Arab Spring uprising. What was the last country that NATO worked together to deal? What was the last intervention by NATO in this part of the world? The most recent one. Which country? Not Syria. So it's getting Syria. We're talking as a group. You got the Russians are involved, right? You have now they just initiated soft power support. United States with regards to the Syrians. or let's say the rebels that are fighting the Syrian regime, okay? But prior to that, NATO was involved in what country? Libya. Okay? Now, remember the criticisms of NATO in the news media. What were the criticisms? What were the major criticisms? It took NATO a long time to do what? To come up with a plan, right? Why? Because, why? Well, it took a long time because you have to have everybody had to do what? And agree. So, I mean, it's one thing if you got one country, he's got the president or the prime minister, and as long as he has the support of his party, okay, or in terms of the United States, as long as there's support in Congress, the president can pretty much, act and make a decision, right? In terms of once you get into these kind of organizations, these intergovernmental organizations, everybody who is a member has to sign off on it. And then what happened? Now remember the examples of bounded rationality and unbounded rationality? It became more and more complicated the more people began to participate in the decision-making structure. Okay? So again, the point here is that it reduces adaptability. It's interesting, they just kind of like disappeared. The guys next door. Okay. All right. Provoke fears, eliminate bargaining advantages that come from eliminate bargaining advantages that come from ambiguity, provoke fears of diversity, entangle disputes.
Hey, it's working.
Thank you.
Sorry. I just really randomly set up. Sorry.
All right. Okay. So again, what you have all these different kind of examples where a country is no longer acting in its own interest, but it has to take into account other countries' interests. And what that begins to do, it begins to kind of water down. Guys, I'm really sorry about this, but what can I do? Stimulate envy of states outside the alliance. Again, what you preserve existing rivalries. But having said all of that, the bottom line is as complicated as it becomes, realists feel that there is a value to for entering into alliances, which is actually very interesting. The bottom line is this, and I think that everybody agrees, whether you're realist, neorealist, liberal, neoliberal, the point is this. These countries will stay in alliance as long as it's in their self-interest. Okay? Is it ready? Okay. No. They're just taking a test next.
So you want to?
No. Yeah, I just want to see them. Yeah. Okay. Excuse me, guys. Okay. All right. Guys, could you sit down until I tell everybody to go? Okay. So that's what we have. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. All right. This is what we're going to do, ladies. If you can let's take a break here for a second. Those of you that have to take a test, you leave everything here, okay? And please go. And everybody's got. See the first. Who's one?